When I turned 65 and ended up with a couple of grandbabies, I began to think about who they were and where they came from and where I had come from and where my dad had come from and his dad before him, all the way back into the mists of time. We started out in Vass, North Carolina, and we ended up here in Scotland. And so in the search for Vasses in Scotland, we're going to take you on a bit of an adventure to figure out what was real and what was not real, what worked and what didn't, and how and why these people were here.
In our research, we have worked to avoid myths, and some facts will never be known for sure, since much of the Vass name history has been ground away by the erosion of time. However, this is what we found. The Vass name has skipped around Scotland, a country where religion, politics, and war have exterminated entire clans along with their surnames. Scotland is a land apart from Europe, isolated by water, yet it stands on the shoulders of England. Conceived by a collision of tectonic plates, a rift in the earth, known as the Highland Line, would create rifts in attitudes, economics, religion, and language for centuries. We begin our history around 4500 BC when Stone Age settlers arrived in Scotland. From 3000 BC to 700 BC, a Neolithic people called the Picts flourished in the Highlands. Pict means painted ones. They were eventually absorbed by subsequent invaders and immigrants, and their culture remains a mystery. The evidence of their passing is left to us in ceremonial standing stones that have never been translated. Every clan in Scotland has Pictish blood. If you have Scots blood, you also carry the blood of the Picts. In 43 AD, the Romans came to England, called the northern natives Scoti, and stayed for 400 years. But never conquered the Highlands. In 563, the Celts came from Ireland with St. Columba, who brought the somewhat civilizing force of Christianity as well as the Gaelic language, which replaced the primitive language of the Picts. In 793, the Vikings invaded from Norway, eventually becoming part of the permanent population. Its lands often invaded. The Highlands bred tough, self-reliant, suspicious, and dangerous people, and Roman and English occupiers were usually divided, decimated, and dispersed back to the lowlands. Even Roman-built walls couldn't prevent the murder and mayhem delivered by screaming warriors swinging short swords and battle axes. We begin our name search at the Inverness Library with a scholar and expert on Scots names and families, Alistair MacLeod, who spends 2 hours with us explaining the origins of our name. In those days, the world was a smaller place, and very few people had surnames. There was little need to go beyond names like James the Black or Davidina, the daughter of David. However, nobles had surnames, influence in the government, and could read and write. History is written and often rewritten by the winners. The losers disappear forever. We are surprised when Alistair tells us that a precursor to the Vass name, Devoe, shows up in history more than 1,000 years ago. In 1066, William the Conqueror brought his French-Norman army to seize the English crown. With the help of his army, friends, and knights, he defeated the English at the Battle of Hastings and established Norman control of the country. Itard and Robert Devoe were two of William the Conqueror's knights. William distributed 4/5 of the land to the knights and the friends who had helped him. The Devoes were the recipients of some of these royal land grants. In 1155, their heir, John Devoe, acquired a small but wealthy estate, and Dirleton Castle, the Scots pronounce it Diddleton, was built in 1220. It is Scotland's best preserved castle of that era. The vast name in the forms of Devoe and De Valibus make other appearances through history. In 1174, there was an early mention of a relative up north in Scotland, Robert Devoe. A year later, John de Valibus was handed over to King John of England to be held as a noble hostage to guarantee the good behavior of the King of the Scots. To be a hostage, his life had to be of high value to the Scots. John de Valibus also shows up again in 1244 and in 1255, engaging in politics. For the first 400 years, Diddleton Castle was home to the Devoes. They lived at the top of the political and social pyramid, and they lived in style. If the Devoes were your ancestors, Diddleton was your first real home outside of France. Wanderlust came easily to these folks when land and power was the payoff. In the 13th century, the Devoes also show up on the Fern Peninsula. Fern Abbey, known as the Lamp of the North, was founded in 1238 by monks who arrived from France to build an abbey and help stamp out the heathen Celtic church. Known as white monks, they were not required to be celibate, had many children, controlled land and cattle, and had plenty of money. Vast families grew up across the Fern Peninsula, where some achieved wealth and station both in the church and as experts in the law. They were referred to as Mr., indicating respect for their station. Above the Highland line is a geography so different from the lowlands that its history was one of barbarism, feuds, superstition, and a fierce tribal culture. The Highlanders were different in dress, language, and social customs. They dressed in kilts, spoke Gaelic and French. While just a few hundred miles south, in the lowlands, Edinburgh would become the center of the Renaissance and much of enlightened thought. Since the days of the Picts, the clan system in Scotland was tribal in nature and the established structure of local government. The king owned all the land and collected tribute from the clans. Each clan had its own territory, and the clan chief watched over the land and protected it at the point of sword. The clan code granted the clan chieftain the power over life and death, because he was the law, the military commander, political power, and survival itself to the families living under the chieftain. In his natural habitat, surrounded by his henchmen, his bard, his pipers, and his gillies, the Highland chieftain could be an awe-inspiring figure. But like his followers, most clan chiefs were the product of a fundamental and intractable poverty. The agreement between the chief and his dependents was,
"I'll give ye security and make sure ye dinna go hungry. And in return, ye will give me loyalty, modest rents for the use of the land, and service to fight and die when needed."
The chief's power and wealth was measured by how many warriors he had. A clan became a clan when a chief could mount 250 armed fighting men on horseback within 1 hour. Since there weren't enough Vasses to form their own clan, they attached themselves to both the Ross and Monroe clans. These neighbors provided protection from the fickle winds of politics, thievery, and the uncertain economics of the Northern Highlands. The Monroe clan received the lands of East Dingwall in Rossshire at the beginning of the 11th century, when they arrived to help expel the Norsemen from Scotland. These lands later became the Barony of Fowles. The Monroe and Ross clan chiefs were the political and economic heads of Easter Ross. Under the two clans, there were 15 or more septs with such names as Was, McCulloch, Dingwall, and Tulloch. Some perspective on the relative sizes of the fighting forces the clans could raise. In 1557, 100 Monroes mustered for battle. As time passed, the clans grew, and in 1668, 1,600 Rosses and Monroes made up a private army. Vasses were most certainly among those fighting forces. This ready, trained, well-armed, and fierce fighting force ultimately served the king, and in return for their loyalty, sometimes the king charged only a nominal rent for the clan's land. The Monroe's rent for the Fowles barony was a snowball delivered in midsummer, or 3 pennies a year. Clan chief Donald Monroe built the original tower around 1164. The clan chief was, and still is, an inherited position. Today it looks much as it did in 1800 and has been owned and occupied by the Monroes for 8 centuries. Miss Patrick Monroe is a charming and highly articulate woman who welcomed us warmly and gave us the tour of Fowles Castle.
Castile Fowles na Fian.
Fowles Castle in Flames was the Monroe battle cry. And battle they did. Sometimes the battles were between clans, sometimes between kings. During an uprising in 1249, 11 Monroes in the line of succession were killed, and clan leadership fell to an 8-year-old boy. And the Monroes were lucky. Many clans on the losing side were exterminated along with their clan name. never to be heard from again. The Vasses were reputed to be stonemasons, lawyers, and clergymen, but everybody, even the lawyers and the preachers, were also farmers until the next conflict brewed into a battle. After any particular contest was over, clansmen went back to their farms and trades. In the early 1300s, Robert Monroe of Fowles, along with the Rosses and their vassals, that would be us, fought in a decisive battle between the English and the Scots. For centuries, the Scots chafed under the rule of the English. The rebel William Wallace waged guerrilla war against the crown using hit-and-run tactics. In 1305, Wallace was captured, drawn and quartered by the English, and hope for Scottish freedom from the English king faded. But slowly, over the next few years, town by town, castle by castle, Robert the Bruce and his Scots rebels began to reclaim their turf until they controlled all but 4 castles in the south along the Firth of Forth. By 1314, English King Edward II, embarrassed by the determined and successful Scots rebels, lost his patience and decided that the time had come to end their resistance for all time. He assembled a fearsome force of 20,000 professional fighters, mounted cavalry, archers, foot soldiers, all supported by 200 heavy wagons and mercenary knights from France and Germany. King of the Scots, Robert the Bruce, assembled some 5,500 Highland fighters, Rosses, Monroes, and Vasses among them. They were equipped with spears, longbows, and axes to meet the heavily armed and technologically superior English army. King Edward himself rode along so that he personally might enjoy the easy victory and final bloody revenge over the outnumbered and lightly equipped fighters of Robert the Bruce and his barbaric Highlanders. But Bruce used his tactical genius to shrink the battlefield. He chose the terrain where the fighting would take place. Advancing from higher, drier ground, he forced the English into tight groups and trapped them in the serpentine curl of a deep tidal stream, the Bannock Burn. With water at their back, the English forces became so bunched up they could not fight. The bowmen could not shoot, the spearmen could not thrust, the knights could not charge. In a killing frenzy, Bruce's infantry systematically cut them down with swords and axes until the English broke and fled in panic, pursued by the bloodlusted Scots. Knights, nobles, cavalry, all the foot soldiers and archers were killed. The 50-foot-wide tidal stream that blocked their only escape was so filled with dead that it could be crossed with dry feet. King Edward ran for his life. In the greatest battle in Scottish history, independence was won, and Robert the Bruce was established as the undisputed King of the Scots at the Battle of Bannockburn. In the Declaration of Arbroath was written,
"As long as 100 of us shall remain, we shall never be subject to English dominion, because it is nae for the glory or riches or honours that we fight, but for freedom alone."
Learning the deadly lessons of Bannockburn, the English would not invade Scotland again for centuries. Our other political ally, the Clan Ross, was located a short distance from the Monroe clan. Situated on the Balnagown River, Clan Ross began in the 1300s, and Balnagown Castle was the center of our political universe for over 300 years. In 1486, after a long struggle with the neighboring Clan Mackay, the Clan Ross was defeated and never recovered. The old line of Ross eventually died out in 1711. Over the centuries, Balnagown Castle had fallen into what the Scots call an old pile. Then, in 1972, it was purchased by Muhammad El Fayed, the owner of Harrods department store in London. He bought the castle for $100,000, then spent another $30 million on a bit of fix-up paint-up. When we videoed there, the 30,000-acre estate of Balnagown was closed to the public. Today, you can rent vacation cottages there. The history books cite another castle called Lochsline that was owned by Vasses in the 1300s and mentioned in a charter of 1590. Using a compass and ordnance map, we search for a day and find the old pile on a gentle hilltop with excellent views in every direction. It overlooks Loch Eye. Loch means lake. Sline is Old Scottish for eye, thus the name Lochsline. Lochsline was an L-plan tower house and looked like this: 2 keeps, 6 stories high, and fortified with 3 large turrets. This sketch is from 1870. The castle ruins at Lochsline collapsed totally in 1953, leaving only this corner. The Vasses lost Lochsline Castle in 1603 when, for the second and final time, we were declared rebels and outlaws, most likely because we were Presbyterian resistors to the Anglican King of England, James I. The Highland castles of this era weren't castles in the classic sense, but tower houses, fortified homes in which families actually lived and were designed as defensible rather than defendable, a bit more residence than fort. For centuries, the Highlands were filled with small tenant farmers. Due to poor and infertile land, existence was harsh and tentative. By 1745, the Highlands were on the brink of starvation. It had a population of 600,000, but food for only half. They cultivated small plots of barley, oats, and potatoes, and raised cattle, sheep, and goats. Most of the year, food was scarce, and many Highlanders lived poorer than the Plains Indians of the western U.S. Highlanders lived in houses composed of stone, turf, and timbers, with a smoke hole in the roof. Upon entering this rude shelter, a Highlander saw his family lying upon bundles of rough heath, covered by a single blanket or straw, suffering from lack of food or epidemic disease, while the few surviving cows, which lived in the far end of the cottage during the winter, demanded his immediate attention to keep them alive, to furnish the family with desperately needed milk or blood. In rain and snow, the house was wet both above and below. It was heated by a peat fire, the smoke hanging below a hole in the roof and filling the room. In the hard rains, the roof leaked. The water then washed the soot from the rafters and thatch, and it rained black ink inside. Everything and everyone bathed in black. With little or no furniture, the family slept on the floor, each covered by a single blanket. Personal possessions were stacked in a corner. The cattle often required a goodly share of the family's store of oats and barley to survive. Sometimes the cattle were bled nearly to death, leaving them so weak they could hardly stand. The drawn blood was mixed with oats or barley and fried into blood cakes. Life was poverty and violence. Many times even the clan chiefs lived in poverty. There was constant fighting among the clans, and every man was a soldier trained from boyhood to fight with sword, knife, and axe. Clansmen supplemented their income by stealing cattle from neighboring clans using elaborate and daring raids. A historian said,
"At any given time, half the men were off stealing cattle, the other half ransoming back their stolen stock."
The cattle were black. The word male meant tribute. Thus was invented the word black male. Above the Highland line in the 1700s, barbarism ruled and the social structure was crumbling. Meanwhile, in the lowlands, Edinburgh was becoming the cradle of the Renaissance and the magnetic center of enlightened Western thought. A writer of the time said,
"The best prospect a Scot ever sees is the high road to London."
In 1745, a young man from France began a romantic quest to reclaim the English crown for the Catholic faith. 23-year-old Prince Charles Edward Stuart, full of himself, sailed to Scotland, raised an army of Catholic sympathizers from 6 clans, and marched 400 miles south on the Protestant crown in London. The English soldiers fled before his Highland warriors. 100 miles from London, he realized he could not take the city with only 5,000 men against a rumored army of 60,000. He turned his troops around and hurriedly marched back north with the English army in hot pursuit. Bonnie Prince Charlie's exhausted Highlanders were caught and slaughtered at Culloden near Inverness. Vasses and Monroes, because they were Protestant and loyal to the English king, assisted the English army in cutting down their Catholic countrymen. The prince escaped in the darkness back to the safety of French shores. In a fit of revenge for the audacity of the Highlanders trying to unseat him, the King of England ordered the destruction of the clan system and the installation of English law. In 1747, Highland dress was outlawed. No tartans to be worn, no kilts, plaids, or any part whatever of the Highland garb under penalty of law. The clan chiefs lost the hereditary power of life and death. Lands of the disloyal were taken, and some clans dispersed or exiled. Private land ownership laws were imposed on the clan chiefs, and they changed from being stewards of the king's land to landowners and landlords themselves, setting up a human disaster that is still evident today. The clan dependents became renters, tenant farmers working and paying rent on what was now the chief's private land. This land title shift triggered the collapse of a feudal social and political system that had been in place for 2,000 years. The chiefs would turn on the people who had been their extended family for centuries. In 1762, a lowland Norman named Sir John Lockhart bought Balnagown, the domain of the extinct Ross clan. He added Ross to his name and began experimenting with large-scale sheep farming. 20 years later, following the economic collapse in the Highlands, He leased large parcels to a lowland sheep farmer, and in doing so, forced many of his tenants off the land. The idea spread, and the Monroe chiefs at Fowles dispossessed their tenants to make way for sheep pasture. This form of corporate farming caught on, and large-scale evictions swept the highlands. The clearances were not an event, but a process that began in 1781 and continued for 70 years. It was the saddest and most shameful period in the history of the highlands. Tens of thousands of people, perhaps hundreds of thousands, were driven off the land and banished from their ancestral homes that were set afire as they left. When the dispossessed sought help from their natural allies, the law and the church, they were abandoned by both. Some of these refugees would move to worthless land on the foreshores of the Firths. Some would starve in hovels there. Landlords assisted others by providing travel funds, but many would die of cholera on death ships bound for the foreign shores of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Some came to America. 3 Vass brothers arrived in Baltimore in 1772. Some came before that, as far back as 1660, and certainly more came after. And the Vasses who could not afford to leave, where could they go? Like most farmers that remained, they had no good choices. They moved to unused strips of land between the sea beaches and the sheep pastures. Some of the dispossessed did not go quietly. There were riots and killings, but on the foreshores there was still a thin living to be made fishing and harvesting kelp. When the kelp industry collapsed in 1825, a new cycle of poverty, starvation, and immigration began. A few years later, the potato famine cast its moldy shroud across the highlands, displacing thousands more. The clearance's shadow darkens the countryside even today, as much of the highland mountainsides and glens are vacant, populated only by sheep and cattle. Today, many Vasses still live on the foreshore in the seaboard villages, Ballantor, Shandwick, and Hilton, on the north shore of Moray Firth. Their neat houses line the main street, and the people look like us.
Yeah, then there's some more Vasses over in Ballantor.
Yes.
Oh yes, there'll be some more there as well.
Cost too much. So I don't know what to do to get.
Oh yes, my name is Jemima Mouse.
Is foot and mouth? Oh, foot and mouth. I've heard you doing
For 1,000 years, the Vass name has survived wars, disease, clan battles, starvation, genocide, religion, and forced migration. The Vasses killed and have been killed, but the Vass name lives on in our children. If your name is Vass, welcome home.